Hi, so today I'm going to be looking at a game from the 45-45 Lee Chess League for the end of season review for season 12. Admittedly slightly late, but what can you do? I'm going to start with the nominated game from board 1. So this is the game Something Pretentious versus Not Fox Anonymous, which was played on May 6th, 2018. And this game was, well, okay, once you see it, you'll sort of understand what it was chosen. There's a lot going on in this game. Um, so let's get started. We had a modern Benoni, which is known to be a very enterprising defense against 1d4, uh, where you tend to get this rather unbalanced structure. And here white played the move f4, which you can see I've got a lot of arrows designated for. Um, f4, I'm not really up to date on modern Benoni theory, but as far as I'm aware, this is supposed to be the most dangerous line white has at its disposal. And in fact, in the past, it's led some would-be modern Benoni exponents to avoid the pure Benoni move order. And the reason why f4 is supposed to be so strong, as you can see by the yellow circles and lines, white has a majority in the center, and he'd like to be able to capitalize on this by pushing e5 and running black over in the center. And f4 obviously supports this. Meanwhile, in green, you can see that black has a majority on the queen side and often tries to exploit this by playing moves such as a6 and b5 and generating counterplay. A lot of the time, it's not so easy for black to actually get b5 in because white stopped it by going a4 at some point. But what ended up happening in this game is black was actually allowed to play b5, and white just uh, completed his kingside development in the meantime, and just got set for the kingside attack. So it's a very sharp and unbalanced type of position, especially if white decides to play like that. So black played bishop d7, which they almost ubiquitously play these days, and white played bishop b5 check, which is considered to be the most dangerous move, but possibly requires a bit of explanation. This is known as the Taimanov variation, or some people call it the flick knife variation for some reason. But anyways, ideally what white would like to do is play e5 and immediately try to run back over in the center. And white has tried this from time to time, but it's very out of fashion nowadays because black has the smooth retreat knight fd7. And the problem is white's center turns out to be overextended because black's threatening takes e5. Normally in practice, white has tried either knight e4 or knight b5 and has sacrificed the e5 pawn for sort of nebulous compensation. Um, yeah, it's not supposed to be that great for white. And yeah, the problem is if you play something like e takes d6, black just castles, and not only is your extra pawn not likely to last very long, but also you're sort of far away from castling, which is a bit of a problem with the e-file opening. Same thing as if you play e6. Um, Black can just take and move the knight away, probably to b6. And white's center is just overextended. The e6 pawn is probably just going to drop. Now you could at least temporarily eschew the e5 idea and just develop quietly with knight f3, castles, and something like bishop e2, which is playable, but it's not exactly the most challenging move because black tends to have enough time to finish his development and set up counterplay if white's going to play relatively quietly. So that's why uh, the the most dangerous move has sort of crystallized towards being bishop b5 check. And the point is illustrated in the natural variation bishop d7 when white plays e5. And here, unlike in the previous line where white was going e5, black doesn't have the retreat knight fd7. So the knight has to go to some weirder square. And then white can probably push e6, and that's quite dangerous for black. More popular, but still running into the same sort of idea, is knight bd7, when again white can go e5. And the problem is white is advancing e6 next, which is happening with greater effect when there's actually a pinned piece on d7 it's attacking. So black ends up having to try d takes e5, f takes e5, and knight h5. Now the position is still very complicated. There's a lot of theory here, but the general conclusion I think is that white's doing well. Black has some counterplay based on the queen check on h4, but generally at the end of the long forcing lines, white tends to come out ahead, starting with e6. So anyways, all this to say that black's best move nowadays is considered to be knight f7, as played by Not Fox Anonymous in the game. Obviously, this doesn't do great favors for black's queenside development, but at least he's stepping away from e5, he's not getting run over immediately. And later, he'll kick this bishop back with, if allowed, he'll kick the bishop back with a6, play b5, and then the knight might end up on c5 later, which is not such a bad square for that piece in these structures. Now, before looking at this game, the only move I was aware of in this position was the move a4, which is the main line, just simply stopping black from executing his desired pawn advances with a6 and b5. This move isn't without drawback, though. The most annoying one I could find is castles, knight f3, and now the maneuver knight a6, castles and knight b4. And the knight's pretty good on the b4 square, and it's hard for white to make it go away because obviously he no longer has the option of playing a2, a3. So anyways, a4 is still the main move, but the line played in the game looks quite interesting to me. Something pretentious played knight f3. Which isn't the most common move, but it's an interesting try, like I said. Veg, in the book Starting Out Modern Benoni from 2004, gave this move an exclam. I'm not sure whether that verdict is actually held up, but it looks like an interesting line anyways. The point is that black's allowed to play a6 followed by b5, which normally he has more difficulty doing, but white is accelerating his kingside development, and therefore accelerating the upcoming kingside attack. Now, speaking of the upcoming kingside attack, white's not really in a position to play e5 because that square is very well covered, so it'll be a while before white's able to play e5. So often he turns to sort of a backup plan of playing f5 and trying to get an attack down the f-file and on the king side, which we will see a little bit later on. So white castled and black castled, and here white played an interesting maneuver, which based on briefly clicking around in the databases, doesn't seem to be all that common, but it looks fairly interesting to me. That's the move knight e2. So white's idea is simply to transfer the knight around to g3 to assist in the forthcoming kingside attack. I guess it supports f5. In the game, it ended up supporting an h4, h5 advance, which was kind of interesting. And also there are variations. I don't think it ended up occurring in the game, but there are variations where white can sacrifice this knight on f5 or h5 just to open up the black king position. So, yeah, knight e2 was played in the game. For context, normally white tries other ideas. One thing you see relatively often is the maneuver queen e1, queen g3, just bringing the queen around to an attacking position on that side of the board. And you could make the argument that knight e2, knight g3 is inaccurate because it doesn't allow the queen to swing over as easily. I'm not sure how good an argument that is, but you could make that argument. But the most popular move has been king h1, which makes good prophylactic sense. White's getting off this a7 g1 diagonal, which is potentially exploitable by black. But also it serves as kind of a waiting move, in the sense that white wants to play f5 at some point very frequently. But at the moment, f5 is probably very well met by knight e5. And the knight on e5 generally, it's quite active and it serves pretty good defensive functions, covering two key points in black's position, the f7 point and the g6 point. So yeah, after king h1, if black plays rook e8, which is pretty common, I think it's the most popular move here, then white can argue that now the time is right for f5, because if he's trying to attack down the f-file, it arguably helps that the rook has left the defensive f7. We'll touch on this topic a little bit more later on. Meanwhile, knight b6 is also a popular move, at which point f5 I think is also well timed, for the reasons which I mentioned previously, in that knight d7 to e5 is not currently an available reply. King h1 I think might be best met by b4, possibly followed by a6, a5 and bishop a6. And actually on that theme, instead of king h1, white often also plays a3, just to dissuade that. But anyways, returning to the game, something contentious played knight e2, and here black played rook e8. Rook e8 is the sort of move, it's a reasonable looking move, and the computer says it's fine. But it's possible, in my opinion, it's possible it might be slightly inaccurate, For the reasons that I touched upon earlier, like we'll see in the game, White's often targeting the f7 point, and actually he even sacrificed a knight there later on. So I kind of wonder if it might be prudent to leave the rook on f8, covering the f7 point for a little bit longer. But not only that, I would argue that rook e8 sort of doesn't address kind of the main root problem with black's position at the moment, which is the kind of messy development of the queen side. So I would argue that black should try to untangle those pieces ASAP, and I would recommend he do it as a possible improvement over the game to play c4, and after bishop c2, as the arrows indicate, I want to put the knight on c5 and then put the other knight on d7. So knight c5, and yeah, for example, if white plays f5, then black goes knight bd7, and then he's ready to. This knight's pretty active, and this knight's ready to jump into a defensive role on e5 or f6. On f6, it can serve a defensive role as well as sort of an aggressive role by targeting the e4 pawn as well. While if white continues his maneuver and plays knight g3, once again, knight bd7. And here, on f5, knight e5 is certainly possible, but also white hasn't really particularly made a threat. Like, knight g5 is an idea we saw in the game in conjunction with f5, but you can argue about whether it does all that much with the f7 point covered. And black can also play queen b6 and start his own counterplay. Not start, but continue his own counterplay, something like king h1, b4. And I think black is at least doing fine. One benefit of having like this knight on d7 ready to come into the action, like the position where white has his knight on g5 and is considering the sacrifice knight h5, with the rook here and the knight here, it really doesn't work, because after gh5, queen h5, knight f6, h7 is covered and f7 is covered. While if the rook is on e8, then white can follow up queen takes f7 check. More about this later. Also, I should mention here that in a position like this, an additional annoyance for white is that when trying to get this bishop out, you have to worry about whether the b2, that's not the b2 pawn, that's also not the b2 pawn, wow. If the b2 pawn will be hanging. So white might have to start with rook b1 before playing bishop e3, which is an additional annoyance. But anyways, rook e8 was played, which, I mean, yeah, the computer thinks it's fine, so I won't criticize it too much. White played knight g3 as advertised. And here black played queen b6, which, once again, is a natural move, and the computer thinks it's okay. But I think it probably makes black's life slightly more difficult. Because, again, black's procrastinating solving his queenside issues, while also he's taking the queen away from potentially useful defensive functions on d8. Which, again, the queen on b6 looks quite natural. This looks like a pretty normal move. You're threatening c4 check. You're putting the queen on the same diagonal as the white king. But the white king is going to leave this diagonal, and then you can make some arguments as to whether the queen is actually well placed here. Queen on d8 covers the h4 square against any potential queen e1, queen h4s, which is probably not on the table right here, but it's useful in general. And also the queen, like if the knight ends up having to come to f6 for defensive reasons, the queen lends that knight support, which again sounds very abstract, but in a surprising number of lines this becomes relevant. And then more stuff which I'll touch on later. But once again, I think black should get his pieces out, his minor pieces out, and start with c4. Bishop c2, once again knight c5, once again f5, and knight bd7. And as you can see by the arrows here, similar to the point I just made, I don't know, if it were possible, white would maybe like to play bishop e3, bishop d4. But he probably has to start with rook b1 before doing that to avoid blundering the b2 pawn. You could probably make the case that you could maybe sacrifice this pawn and then try to sacrifice the rook, but black also doesn't have to take this rook if he's worried about the dark squares around his king if he gives up his bishop. b6 was played, king h1 and now c4, bishop c2, and knight c5, which, okay, c4 and knight c5 is admittedly the plan I've been advocating for the past few moves, but The computer says it's a mistake here, and this is the part of the game analysis where I try to justify in words why the computer says what it says. So I would argue, for starters, once you've played moves like Rook E8 and Queen B6, which are natural, useful moves, but they're not wasted moves. They're obviously not wasted moves, but I would argue maybe half wasted because they're not exactly to the point. And also, both of them make Black's king slightly weaker. Rook E8 takes away the defensive F7, and the queen on B6 is generally more active, but also less defensively available than on D8. So I would argue, I suppose, that with Rook E8 and Queen D6 in, it's much riskier to take the knight away from D7, because at this precise moment, there's no knight immediately available to perform defensive functions on the F6 or E5 squares. Yes, the knight on B8 will be there eventually, but it's not just yet. So yeah, that makes it slightly risky. Also, the previously White was not able to play bishop E3, possibly followed by bishop D4, very quickly, because the bishop's hanging on E3. And to do that, you'd probably have to make a move like, I don't know, Queen E2 first, which generally is not a move White wants to have to play. But now that Knight D5 has been played, the option is open for White to play bishop E3, which not only introduces the bishop D4 idea, not only develops a piece, but also this pin along here has the potential to be slightly annoying. Because, yeah, if the queen wants to retreat to D8, like once again, for defensive functions or go somewhere else, then there's the possibility White might be able to take on C5, and if you have to recapture with the D pawn, then White has a passed D pawn supported by this pawn, and that could be rather dangerous. A lot of arrows on the board. Let's clean those up. Anyway, that is my attempt at summing up why the computer does not like the move 15 knight c5. Instead, it would like to play the move a5, which is potentially useful for a number of reasons. First of all, it keeps the knight available on d7 for the defensive functions that I previously mentioned. Bishop e3 is still not a move that White can play. It potentially prepares the maneuver knight a6, knight c5, pointing out that Black can get a knight to c5 without having to take his knight off of d7 ever. And also, yeah, I wanted to see if b4 could be played. Because if we're leaving our knight on d7 and not putting it on c5, I was maybe arguing that b4 is a more useful move towards attacking on the queen side than a5 would be. But the problem with b4, as the computer pointed out, is something along the lines of f5, I wanted to play knight f6, bishop g5, I wanted to play knight bd7, which looks like a relatively solid setup. Just keeping things solid temporarily on the king side while trying to push on the queen side. But here the computer pointed out the nice move knight d2, which I'd missed. And now the idea is that the c4 pawn is in some trouble. Yeah. By the way, notice that, yeah, bishop g5, there's no bishop takes b2 because we put our knight in the way. So yeah, a5. Arguably an improvement. Well, probably not arguably, if the computer suggested. An improvement, let's say. And here, if White plays knight g5, like we're going to get to a little bit later on, Black's pretty well placed to go knight f6 and cover everything, because once again I mentioned that once White puts his knight on g5, oftentimes there is a very dangerous idea of playing knight h5, and after, or knight f5 as well. After g takes h5, queen takes h5, there are dual threats here and here, which may or may not win the game on the spot, depending on circumstances. Once again, we'll get to this further on in the analysis of the game. But yeah, knight f6 is probably a pretty decent defensive move here. Knight a6 might also be possible, just bringing that knight to c5, and then if White goes f5, then we're well placed to go knight e5, arguably. So knight g5 is a little bit less dangerous with the knight still on d7. As well, there's f5, which is, yeah, also possible. And here, I have a bunch of lines here which I'm not sure how relevant for practical play they are, because obviously you can't calculate every random sacrifice 10 moves deep in a practical game. But anyway, after knight a6 intending knight c5, knight g5, this is one of the points at which I state my case that the rook might be better off on f8, because one of the moves the computer had on its radar is rook e8 to f8. Because white's obviously threatening like to take on g6, and with the rook on f1 and the knight on g5 converging against f7, you kind of have to do something defensively here. And yeah, the fact that rook e8, I mean, maybe indicates to me that rook f8 to e8 the first place was inaccurate. But anyway, after knight g5, knight e5 is probably the most logical move, because this is a pretty good square for the knight, and also, as indicated by the arrows, it defends primarily the f7 point, but don't underestimate the value of covering g6 as well. But this allows, as mentioned, white to sacrifice a knight with knight h5. Possibly the most prudent move would be knight f6, although this is, once again, slightly passive, and also, I would say, probably a bit riskier than when the knight on a6 was still on b8, because when the knight on a6 was still on b8, you could still bring that knight to d7 to support the other knight. And now the computer wants to do bishop d7 and possibly bishop c3 if allowed, which is sort of the equivalent of the bishop e3, bishop d4 plan, but obviously that's not available at this precise moment. Maybe black can play b4 here. Position's still complicated. Computer says white's better, but there's chances for both sides in a practical game, clearly. But anyway, after knight e5, white does have this knight h5 sacrifice available. And you don't appear to be able to take it. G takes h5, queen takes h5. f7's covered, yes, but the threat on h7 is a threat. And the issue is, after h6, white has available... Well, the f-pawn is able to push to f6, which is the main problem. And the computer wants to go knight takes f7, knight takes f7, for 2 pieces down for 2 pawns for the moment, but f6 is coming up. And the important thing is that, well, one of the important things is that after the upcoming e5 push, the bishop on c2 is going to spring into action as well. This bishop is going to be doing stuff as well. If you play bishop h8, then there's just queen g6 check, king f8, bishop takes h6 check, leading to mate. Whereas if you go bishop f8, then white can play queen g6 check, king h8, e5, bishop springs into play, and you're just lost with black. While if you play, the other line I have here is queen b7. Once again, I put e6 and e5, sorry. And once again, mating threats on the light squares. You can't play knight takes d5 because it's pinned to the rook behind it. e6 might be coming up if allowed. This bishop's still hanging. Bishop g6 maybe is available. And yeah, this is just not working out for black. Therefore, because of all this, black should not play g takes h5, but instead play bishop h8. Because you don't want to take the knight, as we've just seen, and you don't want to allow knight takes bishop either, because the bishop on g7 is the prime defender of black's king, and also potentially prime attacker if black is intending to get a queenside attack off anytime soon. So bishop h8 keeps that bishop alive and on the long diagonal. And yeah, here white is, if you don't do anything in particular, like this knight on h5, you could argue about what function it's actually performing and how to continue the attack. But white actually has a further sacrifice, knight takes f7, which actually is pretty spectacular. Well, okay, you can't king takes f7 because of f takes g6 check, and this just isn't working for black. If you try to run away with king e7, bishop g5 check, king d7, and I mean, probably something. Probably worst case, you go g7, and then best case, you just checkmate the king. But obviously, black the toughest defense is knight takes f7, and here white's point is f takes g6, h takes g6, rook takes f7, which is a sacrifice you should probably decline by playing either queen d4 or queen d8. Um, but then white isn't even down any material. So he clearly, uh, well, not down any material. You probably have to like play queen f3. When I guess like at some point black might be able to grab the knight, but it seems terribly unlikely. Like queen f3. If g takes h5, I mean just queen takes h5, and the king isn't gonna live much longer. So you would, I guess, play rook f8. But anyway, the point is in all these things, white's actually a pawn up at the end of them, so you should probably be doing well. While queen f3 might not even be the best move, you could also play. Computer wants to go rook f4. I don't know. But anyway, the point I wanted to illustrate was that if you play king takes f7, white goes queen f3 check, and if king e7, once again you chase the king down, bishop g5 check, king d7, queen f7 check. Let's put that on the board with mate to follow. While after king g8, the point is queen g3, threatening queen takes g6, and black's pieces are almost entirely powerless to stop the threats that white's creating, with currently, the queen and knight, but also these bishops are obviously involved. And after king h7, there's knight f4. There's knight f4, once again hitting g6, and on rook g8, I've illustrated something with these arrows. Queen h4 check, king g7, queen e7 check, king h6. Now, for example, knight e6 check, which will be mate soon enough. Probably after g5, bishop takes g5, etc. If you defend the g6 pawn by going the other way with king f7 instead of king h7, then the simplest way to win is just bishop e3, attacking the queen, and if it moves, rook f1 check leads to mate after something like king e7, bishop g5 check, king 7, queen h3 check is one of the ways to give mate. But anyways, that was just kind of cute, so I wanted to show that. Knight e5 is logical, but it's very risky if the knight h5 sack works, which it looks like in this case. So given that, possibly, I would say maybe the passive-looking rook f8, but probably just knight f6, I would recommend as the safest move for black here. But anyways, I just wanted to show those things. A5 is possibly an improvement over knight c5, at least according to the computer. But knight c5 was played in the game, but not Fox Anonymous, and something pretentious played the move 5, which the computer doesn't necessarily think is best. It looks pretty natural to me. This is generally the move that white starts his attacking ambitions with, combined often with the move knight g5, especially with, like I said, the f7 point potentially vulnerable. Once again, the f7 point can be defended with moves like rook a7 or a queen to the 7th rank, or knight d7 and knight e5. But yeah, f5 looks like a natural move to me. Instead of this, because the computer thinks white's starting what looks like a dangerous attack, but the computer thinks that black can hold. Because of that, it wants to take things a little more slowly, because f5, while very aggressive, and while potentially very dangerous, can be quite committal. For example, the e4 pawn is now backwards, and after something like, well, the knight can come to e5. After something like knight d7 and knight f6, combined with the rook on e8 and the knight on c5, there might be some serious pressure on this pawn. And this does turn up in some variations where black is creating counterplay by sort of ignoring what white's doing over here and playing something like knight c takes e4 and threatening like a check on f2 or something. Um, yeah, so, but also, of course, it is giving up e5 square to the knight as well, and black can sort of choose which path he wants to take with his knight. But like I said, f5 um, looks natural to me. The computer wants to play, it wants to take it a bit slower, not commit to f5 just yet. And it wants to start with knight g5. Basically, this bishop sort of wants to go to e3, but the reason why it probably shouldn't straight away is kind of instructive, actually. First of all, it's not really bishop takes b2. If bishop takes b2 in this particular case, rook b1, bishop g7, knight g5, and with particularly the knight still on b8 and not yet ready to come to the defense of the king, it still takes 2 moves to get over to f6. White's attack is quite strong here. But instead, the move that I think white should avoid is bishop g4, and I've made a lot of arrows here. Anyway, what I think I'm trying to indicate with these arrows is this bishop, in this position, and also generally speaking in the Benoni, is often not such a great piece. You can see I've put here yellow arrows indicate on b7 it often bites on granite on the d5 pawn, and on d7 it often doesn't do all that much. So black, if he's able to exchange off this bishop for the knight, that's potentially a favorable exchange, because this piece isn't often all that great. While this knight, as the green arrows indicate, often comes to g5 and puts pressure on f7 combined with the f5 push. So bishop exchanging off for the knight is probably a favorable exchange for black, and also, like these yellow arrows indicate, gets black closer to completing development and connecting his rooks. And after something like h3, which isn't forced, just to illustrate, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, knight bd7, and now if white yeah, once again, you could take on b2, but again, with this knight still on b8, it'd probably cost too much time. Rook b1, and then, I guess f5, which wouldn't be great if black had knight e5 in one turn, but with the knight, yeah, not yet on d7, it's probably quite strong. But after knight bd7, and if white wants to go for f5, now knight e5 is even happening with tempo, and black is more than okay here. f5 isn't forced, but that's just an illustration. So, what the computer wants to do, and it took me a little while to understand this. Let's play knight g5. First of all, if black plays h6, if you just had to go back with the knight, then we'd feel a bit silly. But there's, of course, the thematic sacrifice, knight takes f7. King takes f7, f5. And king's position is just getting blown open. Also possible, I think, is probably e5, which opens this bishop, threatens various aggressive things. And if he takes e5, f takes e5, check. And black's king is in great danger. But after simply f5, preparing f takes g6 check. If you try to run away, after f takes g, the rook can come into f7, and the king doesn't really find safety. And if you try to keep things closed with g5, some combination of queen h5 check and f6, combined maybe with e5. Again, black's pieces are still not doing a great defensive job, and despite the extra piece for a pawn, white's doing very, very well here. But anyways, going back, after knight g5, the natural move is knight bd7. And the sack on f6, I mean, doesn't really work quite as well here, because after f5, well, black hasn't made the weakening move h6. So black can play something probably like king back to g8, or even king e7, and fg can still be answered by hg. And here, knight f5 is possible. First of all, f5, knight e5 is quite strong. This just covers everything, and black's fine. While the sacrifice knight h5, which I've mentioned before, doesn't work. Despite the fact that after g takes h5, queen takes h5, you are threatening check on 2 squares. Because the knight's on d7, black has the defensive move knight f6, and the point is after queen takes f7 check, king h8, normally you'd make a move like e5, attacking the knight, clearing this bishop, and black would be in trouble, but actually, looking closely, we can see that white's queen is actually trapped after rook a7. Got no retreat squares. So black wins there. Actually, the only move for white is to play knight takes h7. And there's this whole line, point being king takes runs into e5, discovered check, and knight takes would hang the rook. So you kind of have to play queen b7 or queen a7 and attempt to trade the queens off. White goes queen g6, and now still knight takes h7 is met by queen takes e8. But this could actually be diffused by the, well, in context, quite sensible move, but at first maybe quite odd-looking move, bishop f5. This just connects the rooks, so that the rook, as indicated by the yellow arrow, so that the rook's defended, and after queen takes f5, knight takes h7. It's a piece for 3 pawns. Black's king is surprisingly well covered by these pieces sort of huddling around it, but it's still a mess. So anyway, that was to indicate that this fairly thematic for these positions, knight h5 sacrifice, doesn't really work here. But the best move, as suggested by the computer, is to just take it sort of slow with bishop e3, get the last minor piece out, introduce the idea of playing bishop d4 and swapping off bishops, and bishop takes b2 once again just leads to rather serious problems. Actually, in this case, the computer just spits out the move knight f5, which makes some sense. The bishop is sort of away from the king. This sacrifice works very well. G takes f5, queen h5, knight f6, queen f7, king h8. This looks similar to before, but the queen's not trapped because we have the move e5, and with the bishop not back on g7 and on b2 instead, there's no queen trap because queen takes knight check is possible. So this turns out to be pretty good for white. And the other tactical point is that after d takes e5, covering the knight with the queen, white has bishop takes c5, and the queen is overloaded. Queen takes c5 is met by queen takes knight, which forces mate. Like this. So anyways, you can't take on b2, and therefore if you can't take on b2, you have to play some other move. Bishop b7 was the most useful-ish move I could come up with. The problem, well, one of the problems is that playing knight f6 when white doesn't have f5 already in is always a little bit riskier because you have to wonder whether white's actually able to just push e5, for example, which he might be able to here, I'm not sure. So yeah. Anyways, this is the right idea for white, in my opinion, just to take it kind of slow, and argue that, you know, white has more space. White's going to build up slowly with stuff like bishop e3, bishop e4, try to make a favorable exchange. Maybe h5, h4, h5 comes at some point, maybe f5 when you're ready, and argue that there's no rush. F5 is natural, but it's quite committal. Of course, it all comes down to whether it works concretely, which in this case, I think it turns out not quite to, although it did work out very well for something pretentious in the game. So f5, knight bd7, natural move, heading over to e5 or f6 as discussed. And here, everything up to this point had sort of been played relatively quickly, but here something pretentious thought for about 11 minutes and uncorked the potentially unexpected move h4, which looks fairly interesting, just intending to push h5. And if black plays, I've got some lines here. Basically, if black plays something like bishop 7, you can go straight ahead with h5. And yeah, the black king starts feeling rather scared. As well, something like rook a7, just prophylaxizing, again, h5 should be good for white. Another line I have here, plays knight to e5. I don't think white should go h5 straight away, because then black plants a knight on the d3 square. And this is sort of the reverse side of pushing all these pawns and sort of weakening your king and not occupying this diagonal as well. Is these sorts of things might happen. The knight on d3 has been very, very strong, and the threat of knight f2 very annoying. Which is why you should here probably play just bishop e3, just to pin the knight and stop that from happening. This is another one of those things that's important to recognize your opponent's ideas and prophylaxize for a sec before you return to your own ideas of checkmating your opponent. I don't think prophylaxize is a word. I think I just made that up. That's okay, though. Anyways, instead of any of those moves, black played knight f6 in the game. And that's what I mentioned. White's trying to push on the king's side, but black is making a counter threat against the e-pawn. Anyways, the alternative to h4 is knight g5, when, as indicated by the yellow arrows, the rook on f1, knight on g5 are sort of converging toward f7. And the move to stop this from happening is, of course, knight e5, because, again, that's a pretty good square for the knight, and it defends the key point. Yeah. And here, once again, white can try the knight sacrifice on h5. Which should not be accepted, because, once again, I think we discussed a similar variation before, with the knight not able to come to f6, because it's already on e5, white's free to push f6. And the line goes h6, stopping the threat of queen h7, and now just f6. And after h takes g, f takes g. For example, well, the threat of queen h8 mate is rather serious. And on knight g6, I think you can just play e5. Looks pretty good to me. If rook takes e5, just bishop takes g6. If any capture on e5, just bishop takes g6. If knight e5, you can checkmate on your choice of squares. And if king g7, just bishop takes g5, and mate's coming up, probably, fairly quickly. Bishop f6 and queen h8 is generally the threat. And for example, if you play knight cd7, then you can do this: bishop h6 check, king g8, queen g5 check, knight g6, rook takes f7, king takes f7, rook f1 check. If king g8, queen takes g6, and it's just mate. So the point of showing this, if white goes knight h5, it shouldn't be taken. But actually, black can decline it once again by going bishop h8. And white has a familiar sort of sacrifice: knight f7, fg6, hg6, rook f7. And if king f7, by the way, knight f6 check is also possible here, but rook f7, king f7, queen f3 check. And once again, if you go king h8, there's queen g3. And if king h7, knight f4, the same sort of pattern that we saw earlier. But actually, it's possible for black to ignore this rook and play, as mentioned earlier, knight takes e4. This is what I was talking about when I said black can sometimes just ignore what white's doing on the queen side if he doesn't have any particular threats, and just create some counterplay based on the threat of knight f2 check. So this forces white to take, but after takes, white's starting to take the rook, because if you give check, we can block with bishop f5. And for example, if queen f1, you can play bishop f5 once again. And the rook's in some trouble, actually, because after rook f5, gf5, you're not in a position to play queen take because of rook e1 mate. Of rook e1 check followed by rook takes f1 mate. This is all rather abstract, but the back rank issues sort of illustrate, I guess, that white should maybe have tried to complete development before embarking on such sacrificial attacks. That is a very abstract point, and I've sort of, twisted it to fit my narrative, but that is something to argue. Anyways, I thought that possibility was interesting, of knight g5 followed by knight h5 sacrifice. But in the game, white played h4, which was very, very direct, and black played knight f6, creating a threat on e4, thus stopping white from pushing further. But also, yeah, black sort of committed to not put his knight on the e5 square. So white sort of achieved two things with one move. He played knight to g5, hitting f7, preparing a sacrifice there perhaps, at a moment at which black can't play the move knight e5 to cover that, but at the same time also defending his e-pawn. And instead of knight g5, it's possible once again to play bishop e3. I'm not going to claim bishop e3 is a better move than what something pretentious played this time, but it's possible. Pinning the knight, negating the threat to d4, preparing maybe to stick the bishop on d4. It's possible. I like developing pieces. But knight g5 was played, that's not a bad move. And here, Not Fox thought for a bit, and then he decided he did not believe white, and he played h6. Now, the whole point of, not the whole point, but one of the points of knight g5 is presumably if black ever goes h6, the idea is obviously not to go back and lose your e-pawn, but the idea is to sacrifice on f7, and after king takes f7, play f takes g6, now that the h7 pawn is not defending this. Like, if black just plays some random move, probably you aren't going to sacrifice on f7, because black still has the option of playing h takes g6, and I don't see anything for white here. But, yeah, h6 is sort of asking for knight takes f7, and it's a move you play if you look at knight takes f7 and you decide, that doesn't work, I'm going to bait him to play it. And by bait, I mean force him to play it, because there aren't really any other acceptable moves. Yeah, it's probably okay for black to do this, but also it's fairly risky, obviously. A safer move, well, there are a few safer moves. One safer move might just be rook a7, which again is a relatively thematic defensive resource, defending the f7 pawn along the rank, along the 7th rank. And for example, white should probably play bishop e3 here. If you push forward with h5, then black might just be able to play h6. With the point that, with the arguing that white doesn't have a good sacrifice, like if knight f7, I guess, can be met with rook f7, I assume. Or even knight takes e4, but we'll get back to that later. As well as the fact that, f takes g6, h takes g5, bishop takes g5, doesn't really lead anywhere for white either after the strong move bishop g4, which is, well, white might have had some play otherwise, but bishop g4 sort of just ends all of it, because knight takes h5 next and you don't get a chance to push your h-pawn. But it is important for black to have seen that if he's going for rook a7. As well, there's also quite a safe move, queen d8. Yeah, basically the point of queen d8 is you cover the thing on f6. Thus, yeah, we'll see that for the knight f7 sack to work, it's very important that white's able to play rook takes f6, and that the f6 point isn't so well defended. So queen d8 just defends this, and perhaps therefore threatens to play h6. For example, I gave the line here, h5, h6, knight f7, king f7, f g6, king g8. And in the game, white sort of needed to have rook takes f6 available here, bishop takes f6, bishop takes h6 to claim compensation. But with rook f6 being met with queen f6, this just doesn't work. And if hg6, king g8, rook f4, pretending maybe rook h4, here I've put the move knight f takes e4 as good for black. With the idea that if takes I guess the idea would be bishop takes, in some form, like you take on f5 and play check, and knight takes e4. Anyways, this is all very computery and very abstract, but this is sort of the illustration of the defensive resources black has based on this slightly weak e4 pawn and white's exposed king. Because h4, h5, you know, it's very aggressive, but it also leaves white's king fairly exposed. Okay. So anyway, all this to say that with the queen on d8, it's much less likely that a sacrifice on f7 works. Therefore, white might try queen f3, but now after the maneuver knight cd7, bishop d2, and knight e5, I think black's totally fine. Because well, eventually the counterplay on the queen side will get going, and black's pieces cover all the keys. It looks maybe a bit passive, but black's pieces cover all the key squares. And obviously knight e5 also gains a tempo on the queen. Anyways, returning to the game, black played h6 because he didn't believe the sacrifice on f7. White played knight takes f7 because it's too late to back down now. And here, Not Fox decided he really didn't believe the sacrifice, and he took the knight. Now, actually, even at this point, it's still not too late to, I wouldn't say chicken out, but take the safe route and play the move knight c takes e4. And this is what the computer suggests. Which, well, because the computer thinks that white is very good compensation after you take the knight, so it wants to sort of play it safe. And despite, despite the fact that white keeps his knight, there are things like f takes g6 and something takes h6 in the air. Black has quite a bit of counterplay based on the threat of playing knight f2 check. And white can take on h6, but it turns out to be sort of surprisingly difficult to actually end the game, with white king also being rather unsafe. It's very important that if white takes twice on e4, so let's say he plays knight takes e4, I'll put it on the board, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, takes e4. You've freed yourself from the threat of knight f2 or knight g3, of course, but black's now threatening mate in 1. With the rook takes h4, which makes this rather unpleasant. But anyways, king takes f7 was played in the game, which the computer doesn't like, but practical terms, I don't know, like, it's always hard for me in these cases because the machine says king takes f7 is just a mistake, after which white has a very strong attack. But it's always, like, incredibly difficult for me to judge these things when it's enough compensation, when it's not. Especially when it wasn't me actually having the position, having to make the decision in a practical game. So king takes f7, I can't really fault black for. After f takes g6 check, he went king f8. King g8, sorry. And here, basically, the key point of white's play was, because otherwise there's not really a clear way through. Rook takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now bishop takes h6. So white's got 3 pawns for a rook, which generally is not enough material for a rook, but obviously there are rather strong threats. Queen h5 with something happening on h7 is an idea. Queen to f3 and rook f1 and piling up on the f file is also an idea. e5 often comes into play when this bishop participates in the attack, and this knight can end up coming to some square. So yeah, without, having the assistance of Stockfish, it's sort of difficult to judge because black's not sort of without defensive resources either. Because you've got this rook, which can slide over to defend. You've got, well, a rook can come to e7, a queen can defend on one of these squares. And in some cases, still, knight takes e4 is an available resource. So I'm not sure. But anyways, one other point I sort of wanted to illustrate is if black's queen were still performing defensive functions on d8, there would be no rook takes f6 sacrifice, because black would just take back with the queen, and then you wouldn't have bishop takes h6. On the other hand, the queen on b6, if the queen were still on d8, you wouldn't have the counterplay with knight takes e4 and knight f2 or knight g3 check. So it's very double-edged having the queen on b6, is what I'm trying to say. Instead of king g8, which... It's also possible to go king e7. And, yeah, knowing that in the game, I mean, the king on g8 is traditionally safer than on e7, but in the game, white ended up having a chance to play a tactic involving queen h5 to h7 check and queen f7 mate, and just having the g pawn in the general vicinity of black's king um, is not the most pleasant thing in the world. So I figured it might also be an option for black to just try to run uh, in the other direction. Although obviously, you know, you could argue about really how safe black's king is going to end up being in the middle of the board. So at the moment, white has 2 pawns for a piece, and both kings are fairly exposed. And I guess white's pieces are better suited to be targeting black's king at the moment than black's are to be targeting white's. Because if black's trying to like create a counterattack against the white king, it's probably going to start based on like knight c takes e4, as we've seen earlier. But white doesn't have to allow knight c takes e4. Like for example, there's the move bishop e3 here, which basically pins up this knight. Knight takes e4 never really has to happen. And this bishop could end up coming to d4, where it does some annoying things. It provides pins on 2 different diagonals, supports e5 potentially. Yeah. Computer also suggests that white play e5 just to give up one of his 2 pawns that he has in order to just open up the center a little bit, clear the d pawn for potential advancement, undermining the knight, so this pin might be slightly more annoying. There's the idea of playing b4, which forces c takes b3, and then playing a takes b3 just to open some more lines, and then you can push b4 eventually and kick the knight back. It's a very, very complex position, and yeah. With both sides already in time trouble by this point, it's very hard for me to say who would even have better chances in a practical game, because black's king is obviously floating around in the middle of the board, and white has all sorts of ways to play, including even just going after the h6 pawn, as well as targeting the black king, as well as playing moves like b4, as well as playing moves like e5, or knight f5, or knight h5. Any of these things. Knight h5 in particular might be quite dangerous, because like if knight takes h5, suddenly you have the option of bringing the rook into f7. But on the other hand, a piece is a piece, and in time trouble, it's not it can be easy to let an attack fizzle out. So it's hard for me to say objectively. Like if you turn on a computer says white's got a big advantage, but probably you do have to play fairly accurately to ensure that it keeps going. So yeah, like I said, bishop e3 is possible here. E5 is possible here. Probably. Actually, I think if you play knight h5 here, black has bishop g4, so you have to be a bit careful with that as well. But the computer wants the top line of the computer right now is e5, d takes e5, bishop e3, and if king d8, then knight h5, knight h5, queen h5, planning rook f7, and if you stop it with rook a7, to then b4, cb3, ab3. Once again, with just a mess, essentially. The h6 pawn is in some trouble, and after that pawn falls, the g pawn can go. Oops. Where were we? Here we were. Yeah. And b4 is still a threat. So yeah, this is just a sample line which shows the ideas that white has to prove his compensation if black tries to run his king to the middle. Because it's not like black gets checkmated if he tries to run to e7 and then d8, but white has a good enough position that he can justify being a piece down. Anyway, so going back to king g8, which is what not Fox played in the game. Rook takes f6 was played after some thought by something pretentious, and he ended up down to like 5 minutes after playing it. And what I would sort of guess happened is that when playing knight g5 and planning to sacrifice on f7, he'd intended to play bishop takes h6 here, which does look quite tempting, but the problem is after bishop takes h6, rook takes f6, d8, you've got an h4 related problem. And if you play queen f3, supporting the rook and doubling up, black still has knight 7. And yeah, if you move the rook somewhere, black's just winning after queen takes h4. Computer says white can keep trying with knight f5, but after either queen f6 or knight f6, possibly knight f6 in this case, knight h6, king g7. We again have the material balance of 3 pawns for a rook, but this somehow looks less convincing to me. It looks like, first of all, white lacks a dark square bishop, while black's pieces are sort of in better defensive positions than they would be in the other line. If you try to check back on f5 with the knight, then black is just able to take it. So yeah, takes h6 looks tempting and obvious, but it probably doesn't quite work. So white ended up switching the move order around, taking the rook, and after bishop takes h6, bishop takes f6, playing bishop takes h6. Like I mentioned, three pawns for a rook, but very, very unclear. And here, not Fox played the move knight d3, which is kind of a mistake, as we'll get to a little bit later on. Black kind of has to make sort of a defensive move. Knight d3, I mean, threatens knight f2, but white can take it, and that ends up being a problem for black. So, and I mean, knight d3 does feel a bit carefree, like when white is ready to play queen f3 and rook f1, or queen h5 and some sort of bishop discovery and queen h7. It does feel like black should be being a little more careful, and probably play a move such as rook a7, covering the 7th rank laterally, and for that reason, queen h5 is a little bit less effective, because it comes with a lot less force now that you're not threatening bishop somewhere and queen h7 and queen f7 mate. And black can probably just go queen d8, and well, it covers the bishop against arrows, covers the bishop against attacks down the f-file, covers the rook against this g7 discovery idea, and black's pretty safe here. So white should instead go for an attack down the f-file with queen f3, and I've got a bunch of computer-generated lines here, which I'll spare you from, especially considering both players were in time trouble around this point. So I figured there isn't much point in just spamming engine lines. But essentially, computer says white's better. White has sort of clear attacking ideas involving rook coming to f1, knight coming to h5 or f5, pushing e5 and freeing this bishop d7 at some stage. But black also has defensive resources as well as an extra rook, which does tend to help. Instead of rook a7, queen d8 is also an option, once again covering the bishop, covering the rook. Once again, queen h5 is well met by rook a7, and black can follow up next with rook e5 and chase the queen back. And black's doing pretty well, I think, something like this. And you've got to go back with the queen and then bishop g7, and black's doing okay. And once again, white should continue queen f3 and go for the rook f1 attack. Yeah. On knight d7, knight h5 turns out to be a strong move. On rook a7, rook f1, and for example, on bishop e5, we can go bishop g5, and if queen somewhere, continue knight f5. And if black allows this knight to stay alive, it's going to be a very dangerous contributor to the white attack. And if you take it, then suddenly white has these two pawns, which are rather dangerous, and this bishop's diagonal is getting open. And white's doing pretty well here. But once again, especially with both players in time trouble, it's always just a mess. But anyways, d3 was played by Not Fox, anonymous. White played bishop takes d3. And here, the problem you have with black is if you play c takes d3. Not queen a5, because after queen f5, black has the move rook a7, as indicated by the arrow, defending laterally. And white actually has nothing here, because, for example, if you play g7, hitting the rook, black goes rook e5, and on queen g6, black just has queen d8, and everything gets defended. But instead of queen h5, white can play queen f3, or queen f1 actually. Both moves are probably equally good, and the problem is you just don't have a move here with black, because obviously allowing queen takes f6 doesn't lead to good things for the second player, and if you move it away, obviously there's queen f7 check followed by queen h7 mate, and if you, obviously rook f8, bishop takes f8 doesn't work, and if you play queen d8, then white has knight h5, and you're essentially in the same boat. The bishop's attacked. If you move it, you get checkmated. And this just wins for white. I think the computer starts announcing mate around this point. So in the game, Not Fox played queen f2 instead. So stopping the queen f3 knight h5 idea, but and also attacking the knight. So the material count at the moment, white has a piece and 3 pawns for the rook, but obviously it's still a complete mess. White has 2 pieces hanging, the knight on g3 and the bishop on d3. But white's playing queen h5 here. And the idea is roughly threefold. First of all, there's once again these mating threats on h7 and then f7, and the threat is to play bishop e3, attacking the queen, and if black saves his queen, then this is going to be checkmate. Also, with black's queen on f2, previously it was stopping white from occupying the f-file with his queen, but now it starts to work against black, because now white has the idea of playing rook f1 at some moment, skewering the queen and whatever's behind it. In addition, white has the idea of g7 with the partial point of trying to ambush the rook on e8. And here black played c takes d3, which is a blunder. Other moves are still complicated, but if the computer is to be trusted, and normally it is, they're also good for white. So you have to defend laterally along the 7th rank to stop the whole queen h7 stuff. So one idea is rook to a7, covering the squares. Now white has g7, which hits the rook. So black should probably play rook e5, queen g6. And here, black is in quite a bit of trouble. And even to pretend to survive, he has to come up with a very nice idea. Problem is, if you play a move like c takes d3, white just has rook f1, like I mentioned, and you aren't even able to take on g3 because that knight is covered now by the queen on g6. If you move the queen away, white plays rook or queen takes f6 and just wins the game very quickly. So you probably have to give the queen on f1, and then play something like rook f7. But as indicated by the arrows, the d-pawn isn't really anything. You can blockade that pretty easily with the knight. And the d6 pawn is potentially weak, as well as the recurring issues with black king and potentially the g7 pawn. As well as the fact that white is actually up material now. He's got queen and 3 pawns for 2 rooks. So this is winning for white. The very nice idea I mentioned that black has, that he can use to sort of pretend to survive, is bishop h3, which is suggested by the computer, of course. And it's a spectacular idea. The idea is this. If g takes h3, queen f3 check, and if king h2, I think you check back on f2 and repeat. But if king g1, it seems like black doesn't have any checks. But there's the idea, rook takes g7, deflecting the bishop away from this diagonal. Rook g5, obstructing this file. H takes g5, and now queen takes g3, and black gives a perpetual. So that was an idea I was very, very impressed with. But if white manages to spot black's trick, he doesn't actually have to take it. He can just play bishop f1, and well, he's moving his own bishop out of attack. This guy is threatened now, and white's got a knight and 3 pawns for the rook, as well as the usual attack. And this is much better for white. So instead, rook e7 might be possible, getting out of the way of g7 attempted tricks. But here, white plays rook f1, and after queen takes g3, rook takes f6. Once again, you're threatening rook f8, right? So black doesn't have time to capture this bishop, and if black doesn't have time to capture the bishop, white again has a piece and 3 pawns for the rook, as well as, you know, the attack, which he's actually at material by this point, is what that means. The attempt for black, if bishop h3 is also possible. If you take it, there's probably a perpetual, but once again, bishop f1 is good enough. The attempt is probably bishop g4 here, covering the back rank while gaining a tempo on the queen. White goes queen g5, of course. And after cd3, this is the attempt to take the piece and try to claim that you're rook up. But this is also refuted by the move rook f1. First of all, covering the back rank, which is always useful, but unveiling a threat against the rook on e7. And generally, the problem is if you move the rook, for example, rook e5, queen f6, threatening mate on g7, threatening mate on f8. And black has to bail out by playing queen takes h4, queen takes h4, rook h5, queen h5, bishop h5. And after rook f6, the ending is just winning for white. It's opposite color bishops, yes, but the d6 pawn probably falls. This pawn, if white's careful, won't make it too far. The bishop's got that under control, and this wins for white. So anyways, yeah, those are probably black's best chances to stay in the game, from an objective point of view anyways. In the game, black played c takes d3, which is natural. Black now is once again a rook for 3 pawns up, but this just allows a trick. Unfortunately for something pretentious, however, he went for sort of a faulty version of the clearance bishop away queen h7 idea. He played bishop g7, which actually swings the game in black's favor, and now black has a winning position. Although, as we'll see, there are more plot twists coming up. Bishop e3, like I mentioned earlier, just wins the queen outright, because the threat is queen h7, queen f7, which you have to deal with a move like rook a7, and then you just take the queen, and white is up a lot of material. But yeah, bishop g7 is sort of an unfortunate choice, especially, yeah, in time trouble and so forth. So black played bishop takes g7, obviously the only move. White played queen h7 check, king f8, and now the idea was rook f1, which, to be fair, this also wins the queen, but at the cost of a significant amount of material. After queen f1, knight f1, black has managed to capture a rook and a piece for his troubles. And now actually it's black with a winning position because, well, he's got 2 rooks a piece for the queen and 3 pawns, as well as the passed d pawn, as well as it's probably white's king that's the less safe now. There are some mating threats that emerge there. Black played the move bishop g4, which, okay, this makes sense. This move makes sense, especially if you're in time trouble. Black is just trying to keep the queen, keep the queen from coming back into play. It does give white some hope, however, because it's arguably a little slow. It gives white hope based on the idea of playing h5 and h6. and getting a last-ditch attack in. Which shouldn't work, but like I said, there's some more plot twists coming up. Rook takes e4 is adjusted by the computer. It more or less wins immediately. Black's pieces and his d-pawn spring to life, and White's king isn't safe. For example, the h5 idea just runs into, well, if king g1, there's bishop d4 check. Let's finish the line. Knight e3, bishop takes e3, king f1, rook h1 mate. And if knight h2, I would assume, yeah, just d2. And the pawn queen's next move with mate, presumably. But rook takes e4 was not played because, yeah, in time trouble, presumably Black was worried about White's queen coming back into the game and was trying to do the whole let's entomb the queen on h7 sort of thing. So yeah, bishop g4 was played, and White is now able to go forth with h5. And here we go. So the only move that maintains an advantage is the move played by not Fox in the game with rook e5. Otherwise, White's h6 play is just too strong. Like rook takes e4, you no longer have the rook h4 idea available, for example, and just h6, and Black's already in trouble. So, whoops. So, instead of rook takes e4, Black played rook e5, which, like I said, is the only move that maintains an advantage. And the point is that Black is threatening to play rook h5, kind of like the idea of rook e4, where rook h4 was on the table. If White continues with h6, there's just rook h5 check, which, okay, if at h2, you go rook takes h6. Taking away one of White's connected passers and winning the queen. So the point is that White has to go knight g3 to defend the h-pawn, defend the h-file, and now this allows Black's pawn to queen. So d2, the knight no longer stopping this pawn from going forward. h6, d1, queen, check. Which may look like the end of the game, but it's not the end of the game. King h2. Computer still only gives Black like a -2 advantage, despite the fact that he is up 2 rooks and a piece for 4 pawns. But obviously, White's counterplay is still quite strong. Of course, the threat is to play mate and 2 with, I guess it's not mate and 2, but to play h takes g7 check and h8 equals queen. So yeah, Black kind of has to defend with rook a7, because once again, this bishop is still pinned to queen f7 mate. So rook a7 was played, h takes g7, rook takes g7. So Black is 2 rooks up for 3 pawns, but it's still not the end of the game because White's play continues, even with basically just a queen attacking now. Queen h8 check. Well, actually, don't discount the importance of the g-pawn. The g-pawn is still very important. If king e7, you get to take the rook with check. So you have to play rook g8, queen f6 check, e8, queen f7, still going. Let's get these arrows off the board. King d8, queen takes g8 check, rook e8, queen h7. It's still not the end of the game. Black's a rook up. White has 3 pawns for it, clearly the most important of which being the one on g6, with which White is ready to go g7 and g8. So Black plays bishop d7, which is still the only, not the only move that maintains an advantage, but the only idea that maintains an advantage. Black's clearing the way for queen g4 to stop the g-pawn. Bishop d8 also more or less works, but bishop d7 is more natural, of course. g7 threatening the queen, queen g4 stopping White from queening. Basically, since White played h5 back here, all of this has been more or less forced. Almost all of it has been forced, and all of it has been best play. And here, White played knight f5. which, yeah, it looks like as good a try as any to me. Um, and here, white's threatening knight takes d6, knight h6, doing some things with the knight and arguing that if black plays bishop takes f5, which he did in the game, white will play e takes f5, and then he'll be able to further confuse the issue by having a second connected pass pawn, second pair of connected pass pawns. And here black did play bishop takes f5, like I mentioned. Part of me wants to say, especially in time trouble, it's easier if you don't give white a second pass pawn. But on the other hand, the idea I was going to suggest, which is king c7, when you're not actually the one playing the game, it's always difficult to evaluate how difficult certain things are to find. King c7, the point is, well, you're covering d6, but you're also very importantly evacuating the back rank. Knight h6 looks scary, but this is refuted. Basically, this is the one key line black has to have seen. Queen h4 check, king d1, rook take d4. With mate threatened on e1. And this is why it's important that the back rank not have black's king on it, because otherwise g8 queen would come with check. Now g8 queen, rook e1 is just mate. And if white tries queen takes e4, and now g1 queen, black kind of has to have seen queen e3 check, followed by queen takes h6. With a piece up position that I suppose is relatively easy to win for black. Although I guess still sort of tricky in time trouble anyways. So yeah, king c7 also wins, let's put it that way. In the game, black took on f5, something pretentious played, of course, e takes f5. Now, as indicated by the green circles, squares, whatever you want to call them, white's got 2 pawns. Queen f4 check, e3. And now here, black has only one move that wins, and that's queen g4. Just once again, stopping the pawn from queening. f6 can be answered by simply check, followed by king g1, queen takes g3 is mate, and king h1, queen f3, king g1, queen g2 is mate. So white does not have enough time. The g pawn is being stopped, and the counter threats against white's king make it so that white does not have time to introduce the second pawn into the attack. If you try queen h4 check, then takes. There are 3 pawns here, but these 2 guys aren't nearly far enough advanced to save the game for white. And the right way to do it for black is just king e7, stopping the f pawn from going, h5, king f7, h6, e5. Just pick up the pawns. These guys are frozen. Neither of them can move without losing them. And so queen g4 would have won for black. Queen g5 actually does not win for black. It's got the same idea, but actually now after king h3, white's pawns are strong enough to draw the game. Like it's hard to suggest like a move that actually improves black's position, because the king is actually fairly safe on h3, like he's safe from all the mating threats, rook e2 or whatever. So if black plays random move, f6, queen takes d5, queen g6, and yeah, the computer gives some weird stuff here, but it turns out, yeah, white pawns are actually strong enough to hold the game, and black's actually forced to give some sort of perpetual here. The line I have here is queen h1 check, king g4, rook e4 check, king g5, queen c1 check, king g5, queen h1, king g5, and so on, queen c1 back. So yeah, and by the way, if you go to f5, I've just figured this out now. If you go to f5, I think black actually wins the game with, I was going to say queen c8, but I guess, yeah, queen c5 also does it. King takes e4, queen c2 check. And you skewer the queen and stop the pawns at the same time. But anyways, queen g4, stronger than queen g5, because queen g4 introduces the mating ideas of rook e2. Neither of those moves were played in the game. Instead, black played the move rook e2 check straight away, which is actually a mistake that turns the tides in white's favor again. After king h3, white's winning. It's actually possible for white to escape the checks and queen a pawn. And black's queen is attacked, g8 is threatened. The only check he has is queen f1. Now the king starts being driven up the board, and you can get away from these checks, which is why, yeah, obviously this is all rather concrete, but queen g4 doesn't allow white king to get away, and it just cements the mating net. Anyways, rook e2 check, king h3, queen f1 check, king g4, rook e4 check, king g5, queen c1 check. All of these, I'm pretty sure, have been the only checks black's had, only, checks that don't have hang a piece that black's had at his disposal. And here, something pretentious played king g6, which is a fine move, but the computer suggests that more accurate, I guess, is king f6. Now your only check is with queen takes b2 check, king f7. Now your only check is with rook e7 check. If you go to e8, you get mated by queen f6 check, king e8, rook e8 mate. But instead, you can actually go to g6, and now black's out of checks, and you get to queen the pawn next. So this is what the computer wanted to do. Instead, king g6 was played, which is fine. Black's only check is rook g4 check. And now something pretentious played the very unfortunate move, king f6. Instead, white can win the game with king f7. The idea being that white's only check is queen c7 check. Sorry, black's only check is queen c7 check. King g8. All the way to the back rank. Black's out of checks, but he can still attempt because the pawn is blocked at the moment. If given the chance, white would like to play king h8 followed by g8 queen. Queen e7, threatening mate. King h8, threatening g8 queen. Queen f6, pinning the pawn and stopping queening. And here the computer gives all sorts of things, such as queen g8 check, and if king d7, queen e6 check, which wins for white because after the queens get traded, we give check and then we queen. While if you avoid this with black with king c7, queen f8, and essentially the threat of queening is always enough for white to make progress here. Like queen h6 check is probably forced. King g8. For example, rook takes g3. Now you introduce the second pawn with f6. Black doesn't have much useful to do. There's no checks. b4, for example, queen e7 check. King c8. It's not all that easy because f7 always runs into takes here, mate. But king c8. King f8, for example. And actually, there's a lot of positions where you manage to take this d pawn, either with check or without check, and then you get to introduce a third pass pawn into the play. And basically, despite the fact that he's a rook up, these strong pawns and white's active queen, and actually for as far up the board as it is, surprisingly safe white king. Black's always stuck defending, and white can do things to make progress. But unfortunately for white, instead of king f7, he played the move king f6, which unfortunately runs into a mating sequence. Queen g5 check. If king e6, then queen e7 is mate. King f7 was played, queen e7 check, king g8, and queen e8 mate. So yeah, there are a lot of sort of swings near the end of the game there. White played the rook sacrifice and had an objectively winning position, then missed his chance to win, and then suddenly black had a winning position, and then black misjudged something, and suddenly white had chances. But unfortunately, in the time scramble at the end, it ended up being black that gave mate, which is not entirely surprising when you're running up the board with your king with not much time on your clock. It's pretty easy to blunder into one of these checkmates. But yeah, sorry that this video is as late as it is, but I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I'll get on making the other two review videos soon enough. Thanks for watching.